Hello viewers, welcome to this video. I wanted to revisit one of my videos about Jenkins CI CD pipeline, and many of you have asked me to redo that video. The video that I'm referring to is Kube 49 Jenkins CI CD pipeline in Kubernetes, and this was done 2 years ago. Hopefully it still works for those of you who are using Docker as the container runtime in your Kubernetes cluster, but those of you who have migrated from Docker and using container runtime like CRAO or Containerd, this process is not going to work. And I've got a little notes to describe, to recap what I actually did in this video. For those of you who haven't watched this video, the reason I'm redoing this video is for two reasons. One is some of the plugins that I originally used in this video doesn't work anymore with the latest version of Kubernetes. And the main and important thing that I'm redoing this video is because the process that I explained in this video in Kube 49 is not going to work if you're not using Docker as the container runtime. Chances are most of you are already using Containerd or CRAO as the container runtime. Just a quick recap of what I did in Kube 49. So we had a cluster running on my host machine, kmaster, kworker1 and kworker2, and we had Jenkins deployed onto the worker node, one of the worker node. I think I used Kubernetes version 1.14 back 2 years ago and deployed Jenkins master, and I installed the Kubernetes plugin which allows Jenkins master to launch slave pods in the Kubernetes cluster, so you don't have to have physical machines or virtual machines, and your jobs can be run on slave pods. So this Kubernetes plugin enables Jenkins master to launch slave pods on demand when there is a job requesting the pod. And the slave pod that I used didn't have Docker runtime. You can't have Docker runtime in a container. Basically, I've got my code in Github repo, and I've got a job that polls the Github repo for any changes, and it finds a change. It launches a slave agent. It does a Docker build and Docker push to the registry. As part of the pipeline, it also deploys to the Kubernetes cluster. The way I achieved is by mounting var run docker.sock, the Docker socket from my host machine. So that's bad for security reason. If you've got access to the Docker socket, you can basically control your Kubernetes cluster. You can destroy containers, you can pull containers, you can run containers if you've got access to the host Docker socket. But that's how we did in that video. So Jenkins slave launched. This is just a dumb container that contains the Docker command line but not the Docker runtime. So with the Docker command line and mounting var run docker.socket from the host machine, the Docker command on this slave pod actually interacts with the Docker engine on the underlying host to do the Docker build, Docker push in the pipeline, and so on. So given Kubernetes has deprecated Docker shim and we won't be able to use Docker engine as the container runtime, we can't use this approach. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this video is, again, I've got my Kubernetes cluster. If you using my Vagrant environment, just me an open source, in the Kubernetes repository under Vagrant provisioning directory, I've got the Vagrant file. If you just do Vagrant up, you will have a cluster of 3 nodes, 1 master and 2 worker nodes. But I guess, the worker nodes will get 102 for 1 gig of RAM. But the cluster that I've set up for this video, I've given 2 gig of RAM to the worker nodes because I'm running Jenkins on one of the worker node and it actually suffers with 1 gig of RAM. So that's the only change. Otherwise, I'm just using my normal Vagrant environment. If I do kubectl cluster info, kubectl get nodes, kubectl get nodes -o void, running version 1.22.0, and my container runtime is Containerd. There is no Docker or anything. 1 master, 2 worker nodes. Right, the first thing we're going to do is we need to install Jenkins. So there are different ways to install Jenkins, and I've also done a video on how to install Jenkins and manage Jenkins instances in your Kubernetes cluster using Jenkins operator, but I'm not going to use that approach for this video. Instead, let me helm repo list. I've only got the stable repository from the Helm charts, right? And if I search the repository for Jenkins, I've got 1 Jenkins chart in the stable repository, but that's deprecated. So that's the chart I actually used originally in this Kube 49 video, but this time, so Jenkins, if I search for Jenkins in Kubernetes, installing Jenkins on Kubernetes from jenkins.io, and all I need in this page is just the repository. It's here, helm repo add https charts.jenkins.io. I'm going to add the chart and then do a helm repo update. Now if I do helm repo list, I have the Jenkins CI as well. And again, if I do helm search repo Jenkins, I have the Jenkins CI and the app version is 2.289.3. So that's the version of Jenkins we are going to get by installing this Helm chart. Alright, so I'm going to create a namespace called Jenkins kubectl get namespace, and I'm going to deploy everything in this namespace. Right, so first I'm going to download the values file for this Helm chart so that I can see what I can actually configure for my system. So helm show values Jenkins chart from the Jenkins CI repository, and I'm redirecting that to a temporary file. And now if I edit that file, going all the way to the top, the things that I'm going to change here are admin user is admin, and I'm also going to set the admin password here right in this values file. Right, admin user is admin, admin password is password. I need to change the service to node port. If you're running this in cloud, you can use load balancer and you would get a load balancer deployed provisioned for you. Since I'm running this on a virtualized environment on my local machine, I can actually use load balancer if I deployed MetalLB, but I don't have MetalLB running, and I'm going to choose node port as the service type. And further down, I'm going to specify what node port I want it to run on. Instead of Kubernetes coming up with a random port, I'm going to specify 32323 so that it's easy for me to remember. Alright, so Jenkins dashboard can be accessed via node port on this particular port. Right, and then install plugins. I'm going to add 2 more plugins to the list of plugins. One is Blue Ocean, and I need to find the latest version of Blue Ocean. So if I search for Jenkins plugins, and in Jenkins plugins, if I search Blue Ocean, right, we have Blue Ocean. The latest version is 1.24.8. 1.24.8, and the next plugin that I'm going to install is ANSI Color. Yep, ANSI Color version is 1.0.0. 1.0.0. Alright, so if you remember in the previous video, in this video, Kube 49, I actually installed an additional plugin called Kubernetes CD, Kubernetes Continuous Deploy. So if I search for that plugin here, Kubernetes Continuous Deploy, yeah, this one, 2.3.1. I tried using this Kubernetes Continuous Deploy plugin, but it didn't actually work with Kubernetes version 1.22.0. So unfortunately, I can't use this plugin. And if you look at the releases, the last release was like 10 months ago, and it didn't actually support version 1.21 either. So now I'm running Kubernetes version 1.22, and this Kubernetes Continuous Deploy plugin didn't work for me. I have to find alternate way of deploying resources to Kubernetes cluster from within my Jenkins pipeline. So this Kubernetes plugin, Jenkins plugin, Kubernetes Continuous Deploy, helped me a lot. So it's easy to define a code block in your Jenkins pipeline with this plugin that actually deploys resources in your Kubernetes cluster. So given it's not actually working and they are looking for new maintainers, I don't want to use this plugin. I'll show you how I got it working in the end. So we have Blue Ocean 1.24.8 and ANSI Color 1.0.0. Blue Ocean is completely optional. I like to see things, multiple stages of pipeline in a Blue Ocean UI. That gives you a nice feeling. Install latest plugins. I'm going to set that to true, and again this one to true. Alright, so finally there's one thing that I need to do. If I search for persistence is enabled and it's looking for 8 gig of persistent volume. I used to have NFS provisioner running, but for this video I didn't have that NFS provisioner set beforehand. So there's no dynamic volume provisioning system in my Kubernetes cluster. So I'm going to set this to false. This is just for demo, but don't run with persistence disabled in production. Obviously, when you restart your Jenkins pod, all your configuration, everything will be gone. Okay, I think that's all I want from this file. So we've got this file. Now I need to install this. So what should we do? I'm going to open up another terminal, and in the top terminal, let's install this Jenkins Helm chart. Helm install Jenkins. So give it a name for this release. You can call it anything. And what do you want to install? I want to install the Jenkins chart from the Jenkins CI Helm repository, overriding the default configuration by passing the values file, and that's the values file that I edited. And I want to deploy this everything in the Jenkins namespace. So by passing -n Jenkins, I've already created the Jenkins namespace with the kubectl command. If you haven't created it already, you can also pass in create namespace command. Okay, so I'm not going to do that. Let's install that. Right, so you get a nice warning saying persistence is disabled. You will lose your data when the Jenkins pod is terminated. And it gives you some additional information about how to get your admin password. But we don't have to worry because we explicitly set the admin password in the values.yaml file. And then it also specifies how you can get the URL to access the Jenkins dashboard. It's quite simple. It's just the node port service. Okay, so if I watch kubectl -n Jenkins in the Jenkins namespace, if I get all, you can see the Jenkins pod is coming up. It's actually a stateful set, and we have a service for Jenkins. So that's the Jenkins dashboard that you want to access on port 32323. The other one is the Jenkins agent. The Jenkins slave agent will connect back to Jenkins using this service on port 50,000. Right, back in here, I can do kubectl -n Jenkins logs, and I want to look at the logs for Jenkins 0 pod because it has two containers. One is the init container and one is the actual Jenkins container. If you want to look for logs on a multi-container pod, you need to specify which container you want to look for the logs. So in this case, I'm interested in looking at the logs for the Jenkins container. I know the container is named Jenkins because I've already looked at the stateful set definition, so I know the container name is Jenkins. Okay. The pod hasn't been created yet. Let's wait. Okay, so Jenkins is coming up and you can see the logs here. So one of two container is ready. Init container is ready. Now it's bringing up the Jenkins container. Okay, Jenkins is fully up and running. Okay. Now you can see we have two of two containers ready. So now to access Jenkins, all you have to do is access one of the worker node on port 32323. Let's do that. So if I go to kworker1:32323, there we go. Username is admin, password is password, sign in. So we have our Jenkins. The first thing I want to do is get rid of all these warnings because I don't like them. Configure which of these warnings are shown. Okay, so here security warnings you can disable. I already know about all these warnings, so I'm not too much worried about this. So if I save that, and I'm also getting a warning about a couple of plugins that are outdated. So while I'm here, I'm going to go to manage Jenkins installed and search for those two plugins. What is it called? Pipeline Declarative and Icon Shim. Okay. Icon Shim, yep, I'm going to uninstall that. Yes. And the other one was Pipeline Declarative. Yeah, it's down here. Uninstall. Yes. Cool. Going back to the dashboard, I still see those two warnings because I need to restart Jenkins. The easiest way to restart Jenkins is to go to the URL and just add restart at the end of the Jenkins home URL, base URL, and it will ask for the confirmation. Once you click yes, and back in the log you can see Jenkins will be restarting. Yep, Jenkins stopped and it's coming up. Alright, Jenkins is fully up and running and it has actually reloaded. Admin, password. Cool, so we don't have any problems at the moment. Cool. Right, at this point we've got our Jenkins ready. Now I'm going to show you the actual pipeline that I've got in my GitHub repository. So if I go to github.com, just me and open source. play Jenkins. I'll put a link to my GitHub repository in the video description if you want to try this along with me. Right, so this is the original file that I used, and if I show the Jenkins file, you can see the plugin that I was talking about that's no longer working with version 1.22. It's this one, the Kubernetes continuous deploy. So once you have that plugin, you can basically use this code block Kubernetes deploy, pass in the configuration and the kube configuration, kube config ID. It will work, but it's not going to work with 1.22. So instead of touching the master branch, I've created a separate branch, and branch is Kaniko. So by now you would have found out what tool I'm going to use for building Docker images within my Jenkins slave pod. Okay, so if I go to Kaniko, let me actually open up this in my Visual Studio Code CD to play directory. Let's clone that. Code play Jenkins. Let me close this. Alright, okay, so index.html, let me increase the font size. Right, so all I have here is an index.html. It's not a massive application, just an index.html with some content. And if you look in the Docker file, I'm pulling from the base HTTPD image and I'm copying my index.html into the web root of Apache. That's it, that's my Docker file. And if I show you my Jenkins file, right, so this is my Jenkins pipeline. Okay, so I'm still in master, sorry. So I need to switch to the Kaniko. Yeah, here it is. Again, index.html, simple index.html, the Docker file is the same, copying index.html to the web root. And if you want to take a look at my Jenkins file, that's it. I only have two stages. So what I'm doing now is I'm using a tool developed by Google called Kaniko. Basically, this is a tool using which you can build container images without having access to the Docker runtime. So you don't need a Docker runtime. You don't have to connect to a Docker socket. You don't have to have any container runtime running actually. You just need this Kaniko tool, that's it. So Kaniko, if you pass in a Docker file and a destination where you want to push your image to, then Kaniko will build the image for you and then push it to the specified configured image registry. And then I've got another stage that deploys the app to the Kubernetes. Again, if you look in the master branch, as I shown you previously, we use the Kubernetes continuous deploy plugin to deploy our resources onto Kubernetes cluster. But because we are not going to be able to use that plugin, we have to use a different approach. So what I'm doing here is I'm running this on a different container. Okay, so I'll come to that container bit in a minute. But what I'm actually doing is with credentials. That's the default Jenkins pipeline credentials plugin, and I need to create a credential for my kube config that will contain the kube configuration file. It will be stored as a variable kube config, and then you would be able to use kubectl commands within your container. That's it. So I'm not using any fancy plugin. I'm just using a container that has the kubectl binary inside it. So I'm using a very specific Docker container that has kubectl binary in it. So once I launch the container, I would be able to use kubectl. I also need to have the kubeconfig file, which I'm getting it from the Jenkins credential store. I haven't created that credential yet. I'll be creating it soon. And the build and push stage is done by the Kaniko command line. And I'm using a specific container that has Kaniko tool built in. This entire pipeline is going to be run on this Kubernetes pod that's defined in here, builder.yaml. So if I show you builder.yaml, it's a pod definition that contains two containers, sorry. So one is the kubectl container and the other one is the Kaniko container. So that pod, the entire pipeline is going to run in this pod. The first stage, the build and push stage, is going to run on a container called Kaniko, and the second stage is going to run in a container called kubectl, and this is defined in the builder.yaml. So you have this kubectl container and you've got this Kaniko container from Google. So for Kaniko, I need to pass in an extra volume mount, which I need to create again. The work that Kaniko has to do is, so once it builds the container image based on the specification in the Docker file, it needs to push to a registry, to an image registry. It can be Docker Hub, it can be AWS ECR, or it can be Azure, it can be Google container registry. But anyways, in order to push the image, built image to the registry, it needs credentials. So that's where we're mounting this volume. So we need to create a Docker secret. We need to create a Kubernetes secret that contains your Docker credentials, and the secret is named reg credential, and we will be mounting that secret as a volume inside this Kaniko container so that Kaniko can use our Docker credentials to push image to the image registry. So that's all the missing bits. So we've got a fantastic pipeline with just 2 stages, and you now know how it all works. So if I show you my Docker Hub, just me and open source, I've already created an image registry, my web, and it hasn't got any tags pushed to it, any images pushed to this repository. Okay, so now I need to do 2 things. One is to create the kubeconfig Jenkins credentials, and then I need to create Docker secret with my Docker credentials to this Docker registry, just me and open source. Okay, first let's do the credentials. Okay, so back in the Jenkins, if I go to manage Jenkins, manage credentials, Jenkins, global credentials, add credentials, I'm going to choose the type secret file, and here I'm going to choose under my home directory under .kube, I've got the config, which is my kube config basically, and I'm going to choose that. And the ID is in the Jenkins file. I've given the ID as my kube config. So make sure to use the same credential ID because that's how it knows which credential to fetch from Jenkins. Description is optional. Okay, so we have my kubeconfig Jenkins credential configured with a secret file that contains the content of my kubeconfig file. The next thing is to create Kubernetes secret that contains the Docker credential. Okay, Docker secrets in Kubernetes. If I search in the official Kubernetes, there should be a command. Yep, I can basically use this command. And if I paste the command here, sorry, I didn't copy it correctly. kubectl create secret. We are creating a secret of type Docker registry and give it a name regcred, and then you need to specify the Docker server. The Docker server is usually https index.docker.io/v1 if you're using Docker Hub, and then you need to pass in the Docker username, Docker password, and your Docker email. So I'm going to pause the video, run this command with my actual username and password, and then we will carry on. Alright, so I've created that credential. If you take a look at kubectl -n Jenkins get secret, I have this regcred secret with my Docker credentials that I can use now. Okay, so what else? So we've got everything. So now we need to add this pipeline. We need to create a pipeline job in Jenkins. Let's do that. Going back to the dashboard, I'm going to click on new item. Let's call this pipeline demo. Choose the pipeline project. Okay, down here I'm going to select pipeline script from SEM. SEM is going to be Git, and the repository URL is https github.com/justme and open source play Jenkins. This is a public repository, so I don't need to pass in the credentials, and the branch that I'm interested in is Kaniko, and it has a Jenkins file at the top level. Yeah, Jenkins file, and this is the Jenkins file that contains all the stages. Alright, save, and we are good to click build now. So once we click build, I also want to have a look at the Jenkins log. Right, let's keep an eye on our Jenkins log as well. So now when I click build, it's going to trigger this pipeline and it's going to create this pod, which I've shown here with these 2 containers. And it's also going to add an additional container to this pod, which you will see in a minute. That's the Jenkins JNLP agent, which is responsible for communicating things back to the Jenkins master. So whatever number of containers you create in this pod, you're gonna get 1 extra container that Jenkins pipeline is going to add for you. And let's click build now. Okay, so our build started, and if I look at the console output, okay, obtained builder.yaml, so that's our pod specification, and it's creating back in the, yep, you can see provisioning, and the container is getting created. Pipeline demo, that's the name that it has chosen randomly based on the name of the Jenkins job. And you can already see it has 3 containers. It's pulling 3 containers at the moment. And here you can see pulling image, so that's the Kaniko, and then it pulls in the Alpine K8s that contains the kubectl command. And also it pulls in the inbound agent, that's the Jenkins JNLP agent container as well. So basically it's pulling these 3 containers in that pod. So back in here, the pod is still pending, pulling these 3 containers at the moment. Yeah, it's running. All the 3 containers are running at the moment. And you can see it's the first stage now, which is being run on the Kaniko container. You can see the Kaniko command line running. You can ignore that error, and you can see this colorized output. So that's the reason I installed the ANSI color plugin, and I also have this ANSI color option in my pipeline. So you definitely need to have that ANSI color plugin installed on your Jenkins. All right, so that's a success, and you can see the first step. Maybe I can show you this in the Blue Ocean UI. It will be easy to see in the Blue Ocean. Okay, so you have this 2 stages: Kaniko build and push, and deploy app to Kubernetes. And here you can see the output for the Kaniko build. It has pushed the image 1 to the destination, and the deploy app, it has done the deploy. So what I'm doing in the pipeline is, so here I'm specifying that I want the tag to be the build number. So every time I run this job, it's going to find the build number and it's going to use that as the tag. So my web is the image repository, and this time, because we ran the job for the first time, the build number is 1, and it has pushed tag 1. And I didn't actually show you the manifest myweb.yaml. So all I have is a namespace called pipeline demo, and I've got a deployment, and I've got a service exposed as node port. Right, and the image that I'm using for the deployment is just me an open source. That's the Docker ID. My web is the image repository and the tag. And before specifying the tag, I'm actually doing a set command to replace the tag with the current build number. And back in here, you can see is changed and kubectl apply command succeeded. So we have a namespace called pipeline demo. We've got a deployment. We've got a service as well. Right, so I'm going to go back to the normal view, and let's see what we have in our Kubernetes cluster. Kubectl get all. We don't have anything. Kubectl -n. Pipeline demo. Yeah, so we have our myweb pod running, and we have our service of type node port, and it is 3223. So we should be able to access our web application deployed through the Jenkins pipeline automatically for us. So kworker2 this time, 32223. Cool, so that's my fancy application. Welcome to Jasmine Open Source. That's version 1.0. I'm going to update the index.html file, edit. So let's change version 1.0 to 2.0. Updated the version. Commit the change. Right, cool. So welcome to Jasmine Open Source. I've just changed version from 1.0 to 2.0. So now our pipeline should pick up this new change, build a new container, push it to Docker Hub, and then deploy this to our Kubernetes cluster. And again, if I go to my Docker Hub and refresh, you should see my first image 1 that's pushed 5 minutes ago. And now we should see another image based on the build number. So this is the second time we are triggering the pipeline. So there are a couple of different ways. Now I'm triggering the pipeline manually. The ideal way is to configure your pipeline to pull your GitHub repository every few minutes, or let's say every 5 minutes you pull the GitHub for any new pushes, any new commits, and if it finds any new commits, it will just trigger the pipeline. Right, so if I build now, it should fetch the new changes, build new image, and you can already see the one that it used for my previous job is already gone. It has actually terminated all those things, and it's again running because all the containers were previously pulled in. This time it started quickly, and now it's going to the first stage where it builds the container using Kaniko, and you can already see here it has found the tag as 2 because this is the second job. Pushing image to Jasmine Open Source. Now it's doing the second stage. Right, you can see namespace unchanged. I'm doing kubectl apply. Don't use kubectl create because we're going to be using this pipeline over and over again. It would be useful to use kubectl apply, so you can apply, you can update your existing stuff. Deployment, it has changed the image from version 1 to 2, so that's definitely something that has changed and it's a success. Now let's go to our dashboard and just refresh it, and you see version 2.0. and back in here, if I do pipeline get all, you can see this part was created just 38 seconds ago, so definitely that was the new part. Okay, and let's take a look at our pipeline in Blue Ocean. Alright, so we have 2 runs, and in the Docker Hub, if I refresh, we should have 2 tags and everything is working okay. Right, so basically I've set the stage for you. It's a very simple workflow. Just use this and you can build up on it, and if you've got any questions, let me know. I'll be happy to help. I will see you all in my next video. Until then, keep learning and keep on learning. Bye bye.